So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we are going to be looking at a worship psalm, one that is kind of exemplary of what many of the worship songs kind of work, how they work, what they do, what they look like. We're looking at Psalm 145. And I wanted us, before we kind of read this, to just think through real briefly, like, what exactly is worship? What is praise? Why do we do it? It's a good religious, churchy word. Um, but what exactly are we doing? What's the point of it? What are the benefits for us personally? What are the benefits for us in connecting with God? Why is this a part of our spiritual lives? And on Sunday, I'll give us a chance to kind of all ponder that together. I'd love to hear everyone's ideas and definitions on that, because I think a definition, or even what it's lived like, is going to look really different depending on who we are and our position in life and our experiences with God. So I can't do that obviously in these videos, but I can ask you all on Sunday, and I'll give you kind of my definition, the one I'm using in the primer when I talked about worship. And that definition is our natural response to the mystery that irradiates life. So it's a bit of a vague definition, but here's a couple of things I like about that definition. One is it's a response. Worship is not just something we go and do. It's not something we initiate. I think we are responding to experiences of the transcendent, the fact that there is more, the fact that life is kind of haunted by a deeper reality. However you want to say that, I think there is a response that is inherent in worship. And as I said, you could hear kind of in all of those this sense of that there is more. Now, the problem for Christian worship with that definition is, of course, uh, people find experiences of transcendence and deeper meaning from a lot of different sources, right? And so I think that's correct. We can worship a lot of things. Our worship can be misdirected, or it can be directed at something that is more of a created thing, a lesser thing, rather than God Himself. I think that is true aspect of worship, because worship, the root word of what's going to be happening in the Bible a lot of the time, has to do with bowing down beforehand, with submitting, with acknowledging the way things are, with paying attention. And again, I think that can be directed rightly, or that can be directed wrongly, or a combination thereof. And so, one of the big things um, that this psalm is doing, I think, is trying to train us to focus on the correct things, to worship correctly, to bow down and acknowledge the correct things about God Himself, and just the ways in which we do that. But I think whenever we're talking worship, there's two kind of just lurking questions that we need to, I don't know, I guess put out on the table. And the first is, I think a lot of worship, both in the Christian church and in just human history overall, whether no matter what religion you're talking about, is haunted by kind of this transactional way of thinking. In the ancient world, when weather patterns weren't as well understood as nowadays, when crop failures, when the world just felt a little more out of control, though maybe we overplay our hand a little bit and don't understand the world as quite as well as we like to pretend we do. But you can see that the power of the gods, the spiritual, those sorts of things that are beyond us are going to be appealing, right? We want to get the gods of the rain and the wind and the floods and locusts, etc., on our side. And so we develop this kind of transactional relationship a lot of the time with religion, in which if I do my part, I do the correct sacrifices, I do the correct rituals, I pay my whatever to the local shaman, etc., etc., then the powers that be will leave me alone or will bless me, and so we can be abundant and fertile. And I think this mentality still lurks behind a lot of our approach to God, um, in even the modern church, right? As long as I'm praying and moral, and as long as I'm good and do my part, tithe, etc., then God will bless me and God will make my life work, right? And that's why people get so frustrated when things go wrong. They're like, well, what the hell? I did the right things. I've been praying. I'm a good person. Like, why is this happening to me? Because we've still got this relationship of I do my part and you do your part, God, right? God is not following through on his end of the deal. I think the other aspect of worship we need to consider is, okay, whether it's the transactional God or a God that we're simply afraid of, that we're doing those things because we don't want to get, smoten, whatever. We don't want to be punished, and so we behave in certain ways. Is that God going to inspire worship? Fear, maybe, but is kind of a bully too. And so I think when we enter into worship, we have to ask ourselves the question, is our image of God, is the God we are talking about actually worth worshiping, actually worth following, as our belief is that God came and lived among us and invited us into apprenticeship, into discipleship with following him. Is this God worth following? And I think that's another question we always have to be asking ourselves, no matter what we say we believe about God. If our image of God is, yes, he's a father, but he's a bit of an overbearing, mean father, right? Who we have to impress, who we have to do things. It's going to change the way we approach worship. And so I think one of the big things about this psalm is it is one in which we are going to examine God, which is going to train our hearts to follow correctly the real God, what God is actually not like, not what a lot of these things seem like. And this seems to be the way this psalm is often used, even by our brothers and sisters in the Jewish community. This psalm shows up in a ton of their kind of daily prayer services. In fact, I ran into one kind of rabbi's description of this. He says, this psalm is for those who share with a share in the world to come. This psalm is for those with a share in the world to come. And I think that's just a beautiful way of thinking about this longing, this desire for home, for things to be made right, that so many of us have. This is a psalm for us. This is a psalm to train our hearts. And when we read it the first time, it's got this kind of maximalist thing. Like, it's overwhelming. It's like, and God is good about this, and God is good at this, and we do this, and we do this. And it's like, it's a lot to take in, right? I think that's intentional. After I read it this first time, after we allow ourselves to be overwhelmed a little bit, I'll break it down a bit more, because there is a structure here. It's thinking in a certain way and training us in a certain way. But this first time, let's just drown in who God is a little bit on this first read through. So this is Psalm 145. Let me exalt you, my God the King, and let me bless your name forevermore. Every day let me bless you, and let me praise your name forevermore. Great is the Lord, and highly praised. His greatness cannot be fathomed. Let one generation to the next extol your deeds, and tell of your mighty acts. Of the grandeur of your glorious majesty, and your wondrous acts let me treat. And the power of your awesome deeds let them say, and your greatness let me recount. The fame of your great goodness they utter, and of your bounty they joyously sing. Gracious and merciful is the Lord, slow to anger, great in kindness. Good is the Lord to all, and his mercy is over his creatures. All your creatures, Lord, acclaim you, and your faithful ones bless you. The glory of your kingship, they say, and of your might they speak, to make known to humankind his mighty acts and his grandeur of his kingship's glory. Your kingship is a kingship for all time, and your dominion for all generations. The Lord props up all who fall down, and makes all who are bent stand erect. The eyes of all look in hope to you, and you give them their food in its season, opening your hand and sating to their pleasure all living things. Just is the Lord in all his ways, and faithful in all his deeds. Close is the Lord to all who call him, to all who call to him in truth. The pleasure of those who fear him he performs, and their outcry he hears and rescues them. The Lord guards all who love him, and all the wicked he destroys. The Lord's praise let my mouth speak, and let all flesh bless his holy name forevermore. So the structure of this psalm, the way it's set up, is a little hard to hear when you're kind of reading it out loud all in one sitting. But once you kind of see it, it's a little hard to unsee. So the psalm is set up as this kind of, I don't know, it's kind of cyclical. It's got kind of this main point, which is kind of a commitment to worship. And then it's going to circle back around on why God is worth worshiping. So the first one of these comes in verses 1 and 2 when it says, "Let me exalt you, my God, the King," right? So there's a first, "Let me exalt you." There's a commitment to worshiping, to praising God. And then it's going to cycle through twice some of those reasons for worship. The first is God's greatness. So we get the next couple of verses are going to talk about why God is, in which ways God is powerful, in which ways God does glorious things. But then it's going to talk about kind of the reason for worship, and that is the fact that God's greatness is not expressed primarily in power, but in his goodness, the way he relates to people, the acts he has done to help people. And so that pattern is then going to repeat. First, we had the commitment to worship from the psalmist, and then kind of reflections on God's greatness and God's goodness. And then it's going to do it again, except this time the commitment to worship comes from all of creation and then the rest of the community. So it's more of a kind of a communal, non-individual version of it. And then we'll repeat those same things. The reason for worship, God's greatness in those contexts, followed by God's goodness in those contexts. And then it wraps the whole thing up again with kind of the commitment to worship, but from everybody. So on Sunday, we're going to look at kind of the way I did this on this sheet. You can see I've got all the Psalms there. I've got it broken up. And then you can see kind of the big blocks. And so once you see it, it makes a little more sense. It can become a little easier when it's broken down this way, at least for me. So let me say, just kind of read it through one more time, a little more slowly, a few kind of quick comments on things that I think are important for us to recognize in this psalm. So again, this first commitment to worship, this from the psalmist themselves. "Let me exalt you, my God the King, and let me bless your name forevermore. Every day let me bless you, and let me praise your name forevermore." So the metaphor of what they're going to talk about throughout this whole thing with God is that of a king. Not my king, not our king, the king over everyone and everything. And as is often very important in this psalm, I think does an excellent job of this, is showing not that God is not powerful, because we assume that, right? We talk about God, we tend to think of glory and power, but showing how power is meant to be used and what true greatness comes from is one of the big themes of this. So again, is God the king? Absolutely. But he needs to teach us a few things about what a king actually means, since our associations with that metaphor of king tend to be power and bossiness, power and strength, the ability to get what they want. God's going to use that very differently. So the metaphor of king continues with the first reason for worship, God's greatness. So keeping that king kind of power metaphor, right? "Great is the Lord and highly praised. His greatness cannot be fathomed. Let one generation to the next extol your deeds and tell of your mighty acts. Of the grandeur of your glorious majesty, your wondrous acts let me treat, and the power of your awesome deeds let them say, and your greatness let me recount." And so you can kind of, that piece I was talking about at the very beginning, what is worship? The references to kind of the mysterious, the transcendent, the power. We get some of that here, right? God's greatness is going to be expressed in his deeds, but it's also going to be expressed in his deeds to us, and the story here as well. We hear that God's greatness can't always be understood and fathomed. There's a mysterious aspect to it. But we also hear pieces of that story, especially the story that's going to be coming in the original writer's mind, is the story of the Exodus, right? God's greatness isn't in the abstract. God's greatness is in his ability to save, his ability to take a slave people and free them and form them to be kind of a priestly group, a gift to the rest of humanity. God's greatness and his power is not just to get whatever he wants, but he puts that at the service of those who most need it, the least and his own people, right? We're going to see that theme a couple of different times through that. And again, every time these people are telling the story, they're telling kind of an identity piece as well. This is the story of who we are. We are the ones that God has rescued. And for Christians, that theme is just as true, right? It's not just he saved our people from slavery. He saved us from the slavery to sin, slavery to death itself, He has allowed us to become a completely new form of humanity by his death and his resurrection. And so the idea is still there. We praise God not for his strength and his power, but in the ways he used it to save, protect, and to form us into kind of new people. And then so it's going to move on from his goodness to this same thing, the commitment to worship by creation. So it's reiterating the same thing, but a different theme. All your creatures, Lord, acclaim you, and your faithful ones bless you. So again, all your creatures, the entire created world. It's not just about some of us, and your faithful ones, your community, your people. Okay, then we repeat again. The reason for worship, God's greatness expressed in another kind of realm, the more communal, creational realm. The glory of your kingship, they say, and of your might they speak, to be known to humankind his mighty acts, the grandeur of God's glory. Your kingship is a kingship for all times, your dominion for all generations. So again, here it emphasizes both kind of the universal piece of it, but also the kind of stability of it, especially at a time in the world when kings came and went, right? There's always these civil wars. There's always empires even coming and going. And yet here is a stability of strength. And again, God's greatness is not just stability, not just strength, but in how he uses it, which we again get in this more communal sense, these next verses. And this is, I think, one of the keys for understanding how the Bible understands greatness and what power actually exists for. The Lord props up all who fall, and he makes all who are bent stand erect. The eyes of all look in hope to you, and you give them their food in its season, opening your hand, sating to their pleasure all living things. Just is the Lord in all his ways, and faithful in all his deeds. Close is the Lord to all who call him, to all who call on him in truth. The pleasure of those who fear him he performs, and their outcry he hears and rescues them. The Lord guards all who love him, and all the wicked he destroys. This gives us yet another snapshot into God's very character, right? God is powerful and glorious. He shows us what a king can and should be in his stability and his power. And yet, how does he use that power? Not for his own means, not to bully and force us to give glory and that sort of thing. It's not submission by force, it's submission by his true greatness. But the way he uses those things, he picks up those who fall. He feeds and he satisfies. He fills the hungry. We see this theme again and again. Power in the Bible's mind, and especially God's power, is for the sake of others, for nurturing, for strengthening, for making straight that which is bent. We get so many metaphors, for God's greatness is about healing and wholeness and restoration again and again and again. God is one of the only ones actually capable of holding power. Most of us, give us any kind of influence or power, we will almost always put it at our own service. The best of us will also try to serve others as well. But not God. God doesn't need to take care of himself in a lot of ways. Even all of his glory is, in fact, other focused. He's about feeding, whether it's his creation, the least in the world, as Jesus was so good at pointing out, even the weeds, even the flowers, even little birds and rodents, that sort of things, get God's care. God provides for them. God cares them and fills them. How much more so humanity, poor, broken humanity who is often abused and looked past? How much of this says things like God is propping up those who fall. God is propping up those society doesn't care about. God is strengthening and satisfying those whom society ignores, who are not valuable in our eyes when we are mistaking the uses of power and influence, right? I think this is such a beautiful passage in that it goes through again and again. God is great. God is powerful. And how does he use that? In goodness, taking care of those, saving people, whether it's out of the Exodus or out of sin and death, feeding those who need it, fixing those who are in there. And that is who we follow. That is who we praise. And so at the very end, we get this commitment one more time. Because this is who you are, The Lord's praise, let my mouth speak, and let all flesh bless his holy name forevermore. And so, again, I think as we say this psalm, as we look at it, the question becomes, is this the God we are worshiping? Is this the God we are responding to? Or are we following another version, another view of God than the one that is right before us, the one that we haven't experienced? And I guess I wanted to leave us with the thought is, if that's true, if that is what our worship looks like, this psalm is an expression of a probably, a king, right? This is how a king is thinking. This is how a king is looking at the world, seeing what a true king looks like. I'm not a king. My experiences of God's greatness and God's goodness are going to look different than this person. I hope this psalm can train me to think a little bit like David did, to train me to think and see God the way many people throughout history have seen God and followed and worshiped him well. But what's my version look like? How would I express God's goodness? How would I express God's greatness? What does my version of the song look like? What does it look like for me to enter this song that so many of God's people and the entire creation sings? So, wanted to leave us on that thought of this God who I think is worth worshiping. And what does it look like for me? What does it look like for me to do that in kind of my own way?